So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar with PPMD and Capricor Therapeutics. I'm Eric Camino, PPMD's Vice President of Research and Clinical Innovation, joined by Pat Furlong, PPMD's CEO and founder today. And we are going to have a webinar with some of the team members at Capricor to give an update on their recent BLA submission for CAP 1002, Deramiocel. Apologies if I pronounce that incorrectly, Linda. It's always tough whenever we get those new ones. To go through kind of where they're at in the process and an update on their timelines. So we're joined from the Capricor team by Linda Marman, who is the CEO, and Mark Awadala, the Chief Development Officer. As they go through their presentation today, if you have any questions, please submit them to the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We're going to have an open Q&A at the end. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. If you have questions that aren't addressed, please send them along to PPMD after the webinar. We'll try to get you connected with the folks at Capricor. And we are recording this webinar as well. So if you have to step away, if you have friends or family who would be important to see this webinar, should be up on PPMD's website in the next week for playback. So with that, we can get started. And I'm going to hand it over to Linda.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, everyone at PPMD. It is with such incredible joy that I am here today to provide this update to you. And I look forward to having a long-term chat with you as we continue to take Deramiocel for approval for Duchenne cardiomyopathy. Capricor is a publicly traded company. This is our forward-looking statement. All our filings are up to date with the SEC. So we have a little bit of an agenda to go through today, and I'm just going to walk you through this and then take you through some of the updates. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about the Deramiocel path to BLA approval. We have now had acceptance of our BLA by FDA, and I'll be talking about that and when we anticipate having this product available to all those with Duchenne cardiomyopathy. The label that we are potentially asking the agency for. I'm going to give you a little snippet of the data that we put into our BLA so you understand the value of this therapeutic in treating the heart disease as well as the skeletal muscle myopathy of Duchenne. Many of you know, and you've been following us for years, we are growing old together, that we have a commercial partnership with Nippon Shinyaku. I'm going to go through that and sort of explain to you how that works so you understand where Capricor is in the process. We plan to stay involved with this community. Many of you have become our friends, and I look forward to making more friends as we go along the way. And then, of course, time for questions at the end. So let me just tell you a little bit about where we are. The FDA has accepted our biologics license application. We go through CBER, that's the Biologics Division of the Food and Drug Administration, for full approval for Deramiocel in the United States. We are showing data to support the existing cardiac data from the HOPE-2 clinical trial published in the Lancet. And then we took the open label extension data from those that have stayed in, some of them on now for 4 years, starting their 5th year of therapy on Deramiocel. And we've compared that to the natural history data that has been provided by John Soslow and his cardiac consortium, funded by the Food and Drug Administration, that has allowed us to see what happens to the heart in people with Duchenne over time and compare it to what's happening if you are on Deramiocel. We're going to talk a little bit about the label. We are seeking a broad cardiomyopathy label. Basically, what that's going to entail is asking for either the presence of cardiac scar as measured by gadolinium. Many of you start very early in looking for scar in your hearts. It's never too early once there's scar to start treating. And we are asking the agency to not pay attention to age, but more importantly to scar and or cardiac dysfunction as measured by MRI or ejection fraction as measured by echo. And then obviously there's a lot of you that will qualify for this therapeutic because it's mutation agnostic, and every single person with Duchenne ends up with some version of heart disease, because remember, the heart is a muscle as well. So just to highlight sort of some of the timelines to be aware of, first of all, we're very lucky that we are able to work very closely with the agency based on some of the designations that we have been given over time. We have RMAT designation, that's Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation. That's like breakthrough for cell and gene therapy. It helped us to get a lot of access to the Food and Drug Administration. We had over 9 meetings formal and informal meetings with FDA in 2024 as we crafted our strategy. We have orphan drug designation. All of you know what that means, so I won't go through that, but it's very important, obviously, in allowing for market exclusivity. And we also have rare pediatric designation, which allows us to qualify for a coupon, which sometimes can help companies like us, if we can sell them, to sustain our balance sheets as we move into commercial operations. Our BLA has been accepted for review. That was announced, I guess, just earlier this week, in which we showed that FDA is willing to review our not only review our application, but also at this point has found no deficiencies in the application, and will continue their review process. We have priority review, which is very important, and our PDUFA date, as stated, is at the end of August of 2025. So we anticipate being on the market prior to the end of 2025, which is really exciting. So Deramiocel is great therapy to support the heart and also skeletal muscle function. We've shown in multiple clinical studies published in highly regarded journals like the Journal of Neurology, the Lancet. We've presented at many World Muscle Society meetings, our posters, and are recently going to be presenting at MDA, Muscular Dystrophy Association, some of the updated data. But what we don't highlight a lot of times is how simple the infusion is. And I think that's been highlighted by the number of guys that have stayed in our open label extension studies. There's 150 million cells, a simple IV infusion. You don't need a port. You can come in and it's just a simple butterfly. You can take a little bit of medicine prior to the infusion, which are simple antihistamines and a little dose of steroids, just to make sure that you don't have a hypersensitivity reaction. And that's been very successful over many years of treatment. And because of the favorable safety data that we have generated, it has made this application even easier for the FDA to review. We have done over 600 infusions in over 200 patients across multiple clinical trials, and it's very safe. And if you talk to your colleagues out there that have had Deramiocel, they will tell you that not only do the infusions go simply, but they feel and function better post-infusion until the next one. So let's talk for a minute about the cardiomyopathy associated with DMD. All of you know that it is a ticking time bomb, so to speak, in your chest. Everybody gets it. The heart is a muscle too. Because of the lack of dystrophin, the heart muscle sustains injury. What's really interesting about the DMD cardiomyopathy, and Pat and I actually had a chance to talk about this prior to this meeting, and it really validated for me that you in the community understand exactly what we at Capricor have begun to understand, which is that one, the cardiac disease is independent of the skeletal muscle myopathy. Some of you, when you're very young, have some significant heart disease, but not such severe cardiac skeletal muscle disease. And some of you have pretty significant skeletal muscle disease, but pretty stable hearts up through later in age. But what we know is that everybody ends up getting scar in the heart. Scar in the heart means the heart has to work harder to support its function, and ultimately it just gets tired, just like any other muscle, and you develop heart failure, and that is what can contribute to the end of life. And I think many of you know that the cardiomyopathy associated with Duchenne is one of the reasons why people pass away from this disease. So we are talking to the agency. We've shared this data with them. Thank you, Dr. John Soslow, and all of you in the Cardiac Consortium that have been able to show to the FDA that ejection fraction is actually a really reasonable measure of predicting long-term outcomes in Duchenne muscular dystrophy cardiomyopathy. And so now we have a natural history study against which to benchmark our data and show improvement in cardiac function can potentially sustain not only quantity of life, but quality of life. So many of you are asking about the label. We are asking it to be age agnostic. If you have scar in your heart, whether you're young or old, whether you have decline in cardiac function, whether you're young or old or both, we're going to ask the agency to give approval for Deramiocel for you. Shown here is a little tiny bit of the data, which we put into our biologics application. This is the open label extension data. We've shown this in many places, including World Muscle Society, and I'm happy to share these slides with you, although they're also on our website. So basically what we were able to show is that in our open label extension guys, they had an improvement of ejection fraction of 1.9%. And that is directly what we compared to the 24-month external comparator natural history study from the Office of Orphan Products funded data set from FDA. And then we continue to see a benefit at 36 months in our open label extension patients with still an improvement in ejection fraction, which does not happen naturally in this disease, as you know. In the external comparator, what we showed is that 24 months, they had a 5% decline in ejection fraction. Now, these guys were matched almost identically as possible to our open label extension guys. And what we show is a delta or a change of 6.9 ejection fraction points at 24 months if you are in the open label extension study of Deramiocel. This is clinically relevant, statistically relevant, and really can have long-term beneficial outcomes, especially if we continue to see the sustained effect we see at 36 months. The bottom graph is end-systolic index volume. It's measured by MRI, same as the ejection fraction, the gold standard of cardiac function. In this situation, and many of you might know this, but I'll just review a little bit of cardiac function for you to understand, is that end systolic volume is sort of an indicator of how the heart is shaped. The actual shape of the heart predicts how much pressure the heart can exert as it ejects the blood. So if the heart starts to get bigger and baggier due to the disease process, end systolic volume gets bigger, and that's called cardiac remodeling. And it means that it takes much more work for the heart to eject the blood into the body, and then it ultimately ejection fraction goes down. As ejection fraction goes down, the ability of the heart to meet the needs of the body go down, and this can ultimately lead to terminal events in patients. What you see is in the open label extension patients at 24 months and then continue at 36 months is what we call reverse remodeling. And some of the cardiac drugs that people are on will do a little bit of reverse remodeling. ACE inhibitors are the most common of that, but no data is as strong as this, especially in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where we see an attenuation in the change in the shape of the heart over time for treatment with Deramiocel. Now, we also see improvements in the performance of the upper limb. So those of you that have followed Capricor know that we have traditionally treated the older patients, those that are primarily non-ambulant. Performance of the upper limb is arm, shoulder, and hand. Many of you have to do this as part of your assessments, whether you're getting Deramiocel or another therapeutic if you're non-ambulant. It's because people who can't ambulate anymore can't do North Star ambulatory assessments or time to rise. What we show is in the open label extension study, year-over-year improvement in skeletal muscle function as compared to the natural history data set. This is a different natural history data set. This one is from Cincinnati Children's, where there has been long-term follow-up of boys and young men with Duchenne. We treated the non-ambulants primarily early on because our first clinical trial called Hope Duchenne was looking for scar in the heart as an inclusion criteria. And by the time they had enough scar in their heart, many of the guys were already off their feet. It does not necessarily mean that we can only treat those that are off their feet, and we are not using this as a criteria for the label, which will be a cardiomyopathy label. What I want to point out here, which I think is really important, is we are seeing improvement in skeletal muscle myopathy and cardiac function. And while we know that those are both parameters upon which Duchenne muscular dystrophy impacts the body, they don't decline in correlation, as many of you know, and I talked about early on. So the fact that we're seeing improvement in both skeletal muscle function and cardiac muscle function really does highlight the long-term treatment effect of Deramiocel. And we're excited that the FDA is reviewing this application, and hopefully we'll have full approval by the end of the summer. So I want to switch gears for a minute and talk about our partnership with Nippon Shinyaku. Many of you know Capricor. We're out and about in the community. Some of you know Nippon Shinyaku or NS Pharma. They have Viltepso, which is an exon skipping agent. They are our partner in getting Deramiocel into the market with their exclusive rights in the United States and in Japan for sales, marketing, and distribution. We are responsible for everything else, development of the product, manufacturing the product, all regulatory activities. making sure that pharmacovigilance is managed appropriately. And we will be working with Nippon Shinyaku and with the advocacy groups, because it's very important to us that each and every one of you have access to Deramiocel and its potential beneficial effects on your hearts and skeletal muscle. So any questions on this, I'm happy to take. Nippon Shinyaku has a very established sales team. You'll see them around at all the conferences as well, and they are very excited to work with us. Oops. Finally, I want to highlight, and I think this is, probably one of the most important slides for you guys out there, and that is that Deramiocel should go play well in the sandbox with anything that's approved or is coming along, because of the unique mode of action, by stimulating the immune system into repair mode, by shutting down fibrotic processes, and then also by the release of exosomes that drive cells back into the cell cycle and help skeletal muscle to repair itself and cardiac muscle to be sustained. So gene therapies, exon skippers, steroids, any of the other therapeutics that are out there, Deramiocel will go well. I think the payers understand this as well. And we look forward to treating each and every one of you and hoping to maintain your cardiac function and your skeletal muscle function over time. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions. I'll leave my slides up in case anybody wants me to go back and review anything. And I look forward to meeting you out and about in the community. Thank you so much.
Linda, thank you. That was great. Let's go back through the slides and just talk about from the beginning. If you can just pull up slide 4. So I think the community is very well informed about accelerated approval, and that's not what you're going for. So do you want to just sort of update about accelerated approval versus a traditional approval, and what the difference is and why you are hopeful for the traditional approval?
Yeah. So thank you so much, Pat. So this was actually a decision made in conjunction with FDA. And as we had talked about on our pre-call, the understanding of the relevance of cardiomyopathy and Duchenne has been around for a while, thanks to primarily Pat's work. But nobody, including the agency, really understood how to benchmark what was happening in the heart and therefore what could improve the heart, and ultimately make a difference, hopefully, in terms of long-term survival. As this cardiac consortium put together their registry data, funded again by FDA, it became clear that ejection fraction and volumes were one of the major, or some of the major, indicators of potential morbidity and mortality. So once that became clear that we could potentially apply for full approval. That means that we will have full approval. We don't have to do another clinical trial. There's no confirmatory trial. There's nothing more we would need to do. This would go on the market to treat the cardiomyopathy associated with Duchenne. And then we would, be able to have this available for everybody. So it's a really wonderful opportunity. This has been supported thus far by FDA. We haven't had any signals that it would be accelerated approval, which would require a confirmatory trial. Full approval means that unless there's a safety issue, it will not be pulled off the market.
Well, that's amazing. Thanks for explaining that, Linda. So another item you mentioned in this discussion was you're going to look at cardiac MRIs, often with the accompaniment of gadolinium, right? So typically, when we can get a little child or a young boy under the magnet, or in the cardiac MRI, we have to think about age. So if you're thinking label, are you hopeful for as young as age 5 when they begin to see a strain? And do you think that would qualify for treatment?
Yeah, so we are not putting any age limitations on the label that we've asked for. We'll see what the agency comes back with. Exactly. We've had a lot of clinical experience now with MRI and Duchenne, and we know it's really hard for some of you guys to get into the magnet. So SCAR will be one of the indications for treatment, which if you're a little guy and you have SCAR, but your cardiac function is normal, which it should be, we would still want to get you started because it also has beneficial effects on skeletal muscle, and long-term treatments seems to have no safety implications 4 or 5 years out for our open label extension guides. And that's why we're going to ask for the label to have both either or scar or function. So if guy needs to get echo and he's got reduced function, he should be able to get it as well.
Yeah, so if we're talking about an EF and EF on echo, and the EF is below 40, are you still including them? And do you think that this will have an effect on a very low EF? Because as you know, it drops precipitously once it gets down below 40.
Yeah, so that's why we really are working with the agency on full approval, because once that ejection fraction drops really low, it's very hard to bring it back. But we have seen in the few patients that we have that have low EFs that we see them stabilize. And we know from adult heart failure work that people can live, especially unfortunately a non-ambulant person who's not putting a big strain on their heart for a long time, as long as they don't continue to drop low. So yes, we are going to try and treat everybody that has, the indication for Deramiocel, which is any ejection fraction. Why not? Let's give it a shot.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And so just while we're on the subject of who fits into the label, non-specific in terms of outside of Duchenne, we see carriers, we see Becker muscular dystrophy with cardiac issues. So will you have to do a study on Becker? Would you have to do a study on female carriers? Or if you see heart function that is obviously impaired, do you suppose that they would have access?
Yeah, so I'm super excited about the opportunity in Becker and carriers. We are been working, we're a small company, we've been working really hard to get this one across the line. But if we get this across the line, which it seems like we will, it really opens the door, and we're going to rely on our cardiology colleagues, Chet Villa, John Soslow, Larry Markham, Linda Kripe, some of the real leaders in the space that are advising us to try and get the agency to allow us expand our label really rapidly to Becker and to carriers. Because according to those guys, when you look at the MRI images of a carrier or of a Becker patient, they look exactly the same. So it should work exactly the same. But it's going to be dependent upon the agency. We are starting to work with them on that.
Yeah, no, for you and for us, for this community. So, one of the things you've talked about the pool, which we're going to talk about a little later, did you also consider pulmonary function testing here? And did you see any change in pulmonary function?
We haven't measured pulmonary function in the last few studies. We did in HOPE-2, as you know, and we saw some, intriguing signals as we worked with, Hank Meyer at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and some of the others. We decided not to make it one of the endpoints of clinical trials because, as many of you know, it's really hard to measure, especially in steroid-treated non-ambulant patients, where height can be a real issue, and even measuring ulnar length, bone length. So we decided to look at it after approval, and our guys are reporting that they're feeling and functioning better. So that's good enough for us.
Yeah, I don't disagree that the pulmonary function between FVC, MEP, and all of that has been sort of a struggle to get FDA to accept one of those measures. So I don't disagree. I'm happy you're measuring it. I think theoretically, if the heart's improving, we should be improving that whole system, the cardiopulmonary system. So I'm very hopeful about that. What was did you in terms of the patients treated? What was the lowest EF that was included in the study?
Mark, can you remind me of the lowest EF? I think it was around 35%.
Yes, so our studies had an exclusion criteria of patients less than 35%.
Great. So you had some of those 35%, and they too remain stable. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, that's very helpful. And one last question before we go to another slide. This is a US-based FDA, and obviously there's reciprocity in other countries, but not in Europe. So what are your plans to consider moving into Europe and EMA?
Yeah, we're working hard with EMA right now. We have orphan designation and ATMP. We are planning on meeting with them sort of before the end of the calendar year of 2025 to outline our plans to go to Europe. We have preliminary feedback that clinical work that we've done may suffice in Europe, but we're not sure at this point. But it will go to Europe as fast as we can get there. Mark, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're expeditiously trying to expand Deramiocel's footprint and get this treatment to the patients that need across the pond.
Yeah, so again, one last question that's come in before we go on to the next slide is, in terms of Becker and carriers, are you hopeful to discuss with the agency that diagnosis of Duchenne, Becker, or carrier, Linda?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
In terms of,
That's
okay,
exactly our.
great. Perfect. Okay, so you won't do separate studies on Duchenne and Becker and carrier. You'll just hopefully include them based on a cardiac MRI or
like
echo
that.
or whatever criteria. Yeah. Okay. So
I've
let's go to
already,
slides.
yeah, I've already mentioned that to the agency. We've gotten some support there, but we'll see how it goes. And what we might do is, worst case scenario, ask them if we can do a post-market study and the Beckers and carriers.
Yeah. So also, do you think you're going to have an AdCom? Is that on the table or off the table?
They haven't given us any feedback on AdComs. As most people know, the United States government's a little bit in turmoil right now. We're lucky that we're getting feedback as quickly as we are. They said they would let us know about an AdCom. We're in preparation for an AdCom. From where I sit, don't think it'd be a bad thing if we had to have one, because there's such great support within the patient community of Deramiocel, and we'll let you all know as soon as we know.
Yeah. And we're all following that as well. So I'm certainly happy to help you. And I know this community would have their robust support. Let's go on to slide 5. Okay. So actually, I think that this is really about access. And let's go to slide 6, because I think we're okay on the FDA and those designations. So Linda, so the IV administration and I'll say it wrong again, Deramiocel is quarterly. So every 3 months, these patients are getting an infusion of the 150 million cells. Now, how long does that infusion take? You've said 45 minutes. Is that slow or fast in terms of, do you see that decreasing? These people do not need a port to get this because you can usually get into the vein. Is that usually been your experience?
Yeah, so it can be a little slower. So the infusion rate depends upon how long the infusion actually takes. Some of the guys don't tolerate a faster infusion rate, so it could be much faster. Typically, 45 minutes, an hour, sometimes an hour and a half if they don't tolerate well the faster infusion rate. They'll feel a little nauseous or get a headachy. So yeah, it's very fast. They can watch a show or YouTube or whatever they like to do. Super easy. Needle comes out and they sit around for a little bit and go home.
Now, at the end of the day, do you think this will be an infusion center or something that could be done at home, as the antisense are at this moment?
Yeah, not at home because it has to be prepped by a pharmacist in order to be delivered, but yes, an infusion center.
And you give a little, an extra dose of steroids and a little bit of Benadryl prior to?
Yeah, so the day before they have to take a little bit of, a bolus of steroids and then some Benadryl. And I think, some of the other antihistamines are given at the time of the infusion. PRN is needed.
Okay, great. So let's move on to slide 7. So I just want to go back to this because this has been a struggle for all of us in this community, where in years past, other companies have come in and tried to look at drugs that would improve mitochondrial function. And at that point, talking to the renal kidney folks at the FDA in that division, which is where those drugs would have been in CEDAR and then renal cardiac, the issue was that there was no natural history, that we saw strain. And as early as when we can get these young men under the magnet, and then we see ejection fraction changes. And the complaint or the discussion with those folks at renal cardiac was really around the fact that you cannot connect the dots between those two things. You can say there's strain, you can say the amount of strain, but you can't show that in terms of what that does to overall heart function. So can you just go into a little bit of the natural history that you found with, and I will say, I can't say enough for the Action group. Action Learning Group has been incredible. It's a group of more than 80 cardiologists with Soslow, Chatwilla, and et cetera, as certainly some of the leaderships that you've mentioned. So can you talk a little bit about the natural history and how you were able to utilize work with them to figure out the natural history here?
Yeah, so this has been probably the most exciting part of our pathway. We developed Deramiocel, formerly called CAP-1002, really started to put it forward into the Duchenne space almost a decade ago. But again, as Pat said, and I think it's really important to understand that everybody knew that the guys would potentially die from the heart disease, but nobody knew how to predict what would take them from, through the courseway of morbidity and mortality to the end of life. And then ultimately, as Pat said, the Action Network, the 80 cardiologists, everybody got together, and this was all due to PPMD's work, really, to highlight what exactly is happening. Let's look at the pathophysiology and the trajectory of the disease process of what's happening in the heart. Ejection fraction is a measure of how the heart meets the needs of the body. It's been used for many decades in looking at adult heart disease. So if you have a heart attack, it's a big heart attack, you'll have a decline in your ejection fraction. Ultimately, the heart gets tired of having the scars trying to contract at, essentially once a second, and it gets tired contracting against that scar. And so it, tries to accommodate, it gets bigger, it gets baggier, and ultimately the heart can no longer meet the needs of the body and people die. And that's exactly what happens in Duchenne, although the pathophysiology of Duchenne cardiomyopathy is really unique. You get a fibrofatty accumulation, which is very, very unique. And of course, it's a genetic disease without dystrophin. Why would it, progress the exact same way as a heart attack in a grandma? And I'm a grandma, so I can say that. But understanding the pathophysiology, this Action Network and the Cardiac Consortium started tracking in hundreds of patients with Duchenne using MRI and imaging what actually is causing the progression of morbidity and ultimately mortality. The study was published in Circulation Heart Failure in 2023, but I knew John Soslow from going to the cardiomyopathy meetings that PPMD holds. So I knew that this data set existed, but finally we had a published data set. And then because it was funded by the Office of Orphan Products, we were able to access patient level data. So we could actually say propensity matching. Let's take the exact same potential patients that we are having in the HOPE-2 open label extension study. We've been tracking those guys for more than 5 years. And let's see how the natural history defines the progression. And that's what we show here. And I talked about this briefly in my talk, which is when you look at the published data from John Soslow and the Action Network study, you see an average of 5-point decline in ejection fraction over 24 months in those that have baseline ejection fractions of 57%, which is bordering on the healthy level. And then what you see in the open label extension guys is an improvement in ejection fraction of 1.9% with a delta or change of 6.9 ejection fraction points. Now, even in adult heart disease, even in heart attacks and dilated cardiomyopathies, 5 to 10% improvement in ejection fraction is considered clinically significant. So this is very clinically significant. We did baseline matching, we did age matching, we did cardiac med matching to make sure that we were doing an apples to apples comparison of our treated patients compared to the natural history patients. So we are eternally grateful to the agency for funding it and to the Action Network for conducting it so that we could actually have something to benchmark our data against.
Yeah, this is really wonderful. Thanks for going through that explanation, Linda. I think, when we think about heart function, I'm reminded of some of our young adults who have said, an improvement of a certain percent, 5%, gives me more energy, more quality of life, more feeling of well-being. So I'm certain in heart function, if we can improve or preserve heart function, that feeling of well-being and is going to be present and improve quality of life. So thank you for that. I'd like to go to slide 8, if you don't mind, or slide 9. So sorry. First of all, incredible data on the pool, and I'm glad we're gathering more data on the pool because I think pool 2.0 is a very good measure of upper limb function, and because in previous years, non-ambulatory patients were often not included in trials just because we didn't have a way to measure outcomes. So very proud of you for looking at this pool 2.0 and including it in the studies. That said, in some circumstances, as you know, there are some young men with Duchenne and or Becker that have hearts that are well preserved and that look just fine on cardiac MRI. So for the Deramiocel, you've demonstrated that the pool is beneficial, and that's preservation of upper limb function, which is a priority of non-ambulatory patients, and certainly for overall quality of life and caregiver burden, et cetera. All of that matters. So I'm wondering, you're going in on a cardiac outcome measure with FDA. What about the patient who has pretty good heart function, an EF above 55 and looks pretty good, but really is losing upper limb strength? Is there a way for us to think about delivering this product to them to help preserve and certainly in retrospect protect a heart that it seems to be okay, but typically we do see some heart function decline even after 20 years old or so. So in that circumstance, how do you look at that?
Yeah, so there are those guys out there, obviously, and at least in the initial label, that won't be for skeletal muscle myopathy, although everybody will be aware of this data, and I'm sure any of the guys could potentially qualify to get it for their heart and then see the skeletal muscle benefit as well. Ultimately, once we unblind HOPE-3, which, as you know, the performance of the upper limb was the primary efficacy endpoint, that won't be for a while because we're probably going to use that data to go outside the US to Europe and potentially Japan. But once we do, then we can do a label expansion for skeletal muscle myopathy as well, and particularly those that have, a decline in skeletal muscle function, but stable cardiac function.
Right. And then, this is a quarterly infusion. My father always thought more is better. So whenever you're feeling good, if you have a headache, instead of 2 aspirin, you need to take 12, and he would assume that would get rid of the headache. So I'm coming back to this. If you're giving it 4 times a year, have you thought of, would you consider giving it more frequently to enhance the antifibrotic, anti-inflammatory capabilities?
Yeah, we definitely will over time. It's interesting because the HOPE-2 OLE guys will tell you that by the end of the cycle, as they're coming into their next infusion, they start to feel their strength declining. Now, obviously, they don't feel their hearts. That's been stable by MRI, but they do feel their muscle strength declining. They start to feel a little bit more tired, as they say. So we will explore over time a more frequent dosing schedule. We haven't done that yet. But yes, absolutely. More in this situation could potentially be better.
Okay, thank you. And you'd have to do a study, right? And increase the dose.
I would think that that's going to be the case. We haven't bandied that one with the agency yet, but I would think so.
Okay, thank you. And then if we go on to slide 10 with the NS Pharma relationship. All right, so let's fast forward to August 31st. We've had an AdCom, the committee voted positively. So, we're very enthusiastic about the FDA's approval. So talk to me about, and talk to this community about what happens then. So today, August 31st, 2025, you have a traditional approval that is for anyone that has a cardiac MRI showing strain and or people with an echo and a decrease in the EF or cardiac MRI EF. So now talk to me about launch. So you've got an approval. How fast, first of all, will those open label extension folks be continued while you transition them to insurance? And then how rapidly will people who weren't in your studies or aren't on open label extensions be able to access the product? Can you just talk to us about the plan and the process?
Mark, you want to take that one? You've been working on the commercial planning.
Yes. So currently we are working feverishly with NS Pharma to ensure a very smooth commercialization of the product. We are working to ensure that there is a seamless transition from our patients that have dedicated their time and efforts to participating in our trial to transition over to commercial product. And so we are working to shorten the time from PDUFA to commercial availability. As everybody knows, there's always a little bit of time that's needed to get things through the insurance company. So we are taking that head on and working feverishly to kind of reduce that time.
Great. So, and if this is an inappropriate question, can you make a guess? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? What is your best guess? No, we won't hold you to it, Mark, and we won't get your home address. But could you give us could you give us a best guess?
So what I can tell you is from other drugs going to the market, it's on average anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the payer that covers it. So we are working to limit that time as much as humanly possible. As we know, this is really important to patients to receive access.
Yeah, I mean, there were, as you know, in your Hope 3, there were lots of people who were hoping to get in Hope 3, others who were hoping for a compassionate use and just having access under that provision by FDA. And it is, as you know, heartbreaking and frustrating to be just outside of an opportunity that could provide cardiac benefit, improvement in the pool, and certainly improved quality of life. So time is muscle, and I think we've learned that continuously, and we say that continuously. So in talking, maybe Mark, just to follow on, are you currently talking to payers? Because as you know, that process to get coverage is frustrating and often lengthy. So are you making some inroads with payers? And is there something this community might do to be useful there, or might need to know in order to be useful there?
So activities in preparation for speaking with payers is
With payers, yeah.
is already ongoing. And so they will start relatively soon. Obviously, it's a little regulated now that we have a PDUFA date. It's a little easier to have those discussions. So that is currently underway with our partners at NS. So I can honestly say that, activities have begun. And so we are 6 months away now, and we are doing everything possible, not leaving any stone unturned, to figure out ways to limit that time for commercial availability.
We have had preliminary conversations with the payers through NS, and they've been very favorable to the idea of reimbursing. Reimbursement rates seem to be something that they could agree on with the company, and they understand that this would be a first-in-class therapeutic for the cardiac disease, so it'd be unlikely that they would turn it down.
Yeah, and I think, Linda, we can recognize the partnership with NS because they have Viltepso that is currently available in the United States. They have already sort of plotted a path, if you will, with payers. So payers are not unfamiliar with them. So I think this probably gives you some ability to sort of use that roadmap that they've created for this product, given that they're very different. Viltepso skips exon 53, and this is a cardiac indication. So, but again, having worked with payers and having seen the process and worked with the process, and having NS have some help in terms of assistance programs through them, some of this can be mapped right into your product, I'm guessing, as well. So, and so that's the good news and the wonderful news about partnerships. So a couple questions, and this has been incredibly helpful. And I know this community is very enthusiastic. The heart is a muscle. As you know, I'm selfishly very concerned about the heart, asking the question, is it built to last? And what we know is that it's not built to last. So cardiac drugs and cardiac indications are really important to all of us. So a couple of the questions, are you planning any studies, or are there any studies recruiting at this moment, or planned for the near future?
Yeah, so no, we're not doing clinical studies with Deramiocel right now, except for the ongoing Hope 3 and the Hope 3 open label extension study, which is continuing on. We are planning some studies in Becker, assuming that the agency will require those. And of course, we'll look for other opportunities to deploy Deramiocel clinically as the indications will support a fibrotic inflammatory type of cardiomyopathy.
Good, thank you. Okay, so let's just get a hypothetical case. I have a son that is 10. He has an EF of 39. He's had gene therapy. He is also on Duvyzat, the HDAC inhibitor. He's also on bone infusions. Are you worried about adding Deramiocel to this regimen?
No, I'm excited about it. I think it's a really great opportunity. So what we've seen with Deramiocel is, because its mechanism of action is somewhat unique with this sort of anti-inflammatory, but not just anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory capabilities, which is very important because you want to stimulate the immune system to drive repair. And we've seen and published preclinically that the cells can actually drive the macrophage, which is an immune cell, into a repair mode. So it can go from either an attack mode or a repair mode in the body, and we see the cells drive it towards the repair mode. So, I think that with anything that somebody is taking, it's better to have Deramiocel on board because you see stabilization. So the gene therapy, for instance, you still see muscle breakdown, inflammation, and fibrosis because not every cell is able to make dystrophin in a healthy fashion. So this will help stabilize, we believe, the impact of the gene therapy. And the Javinostat drug, I can't say the name of that one either. Duvastat.
Duvyzat. I don't know where they named these drugs, Linda. I've never gotten a hold of how these drugs are named, but anyway, Duvyzat, a Gamma is another one, vamorolone or a Gamma. So the real answer is we can combine medicines, and I think as this community, we've always said, it'll take a combination of therapies to really halt degeneration across skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, et cetera. So I think this is really, really incredible. You can use it alongside of ACE inhibitors or ARBs, such as losartan. You can add it to other cardiac meds that come along the line. So I think there isn't at this moment a contraindication that you can't take this medicine and get Deramiocel. So I think this is really very helpful to go forward. I think this has been really. We are cheering you on. This is our drug that has a cardiac indication, and we're thrilled about your progress. I'm going to turn this back over to Eric and see what I've missed in terms of questions and let him wrap up. But thank you again. This is exciting. We're all for you and with you. And thank you for continuing. I know it has not been a very simple road, but we appreciate all you've done. Eric?
We believe in patients.
No, thank you both, Linda and Mark, for walking us through and giving the community an update. Pat, I think you got through all of the questions that I saw kind of come through the chat. And so just as we kind of wrap up, just wanted to say thank you again to the Capricor team for an update on the acceptance of your BLA filing for Deramiocel. And just as a reminder for folks, the PDUFA date of August 31st for a decision by the FDA for traditional approval of Deramiocel for the treatment of Duchenne cardiomyopathy. So as any updates come out from the Capricor team, if there is any decision on an AdCom, we will be sure to make sure the community is aware and share any updates as we kind of move along. But thank you again for joining us and giving an update to the community.